expresses interest in a service business, signs the NDA, gets access to the financials, the customer list summary, the key vendor relationships, and the pricing model. The deal falls apart at LOI and the buyer walks away. 6 months later, the seller starts losing customers. Slowly at first, one here, one there, then a pattern. A former customer mentions offhand that they were approached by a new competitor offering a nearly identical service at a lower price point. The seller pulls the NDA they had signed. The definition of confidential information was limited to documents marked confidential in writing. The financials they sent weren't marked. The customer list summary wasn't marked. The pricing model wasn't marked. Verbally, everything was discussed as confidential. On paper, almost nothing qualified. The NDA was useless, and the seller had no legal recourse against someone who had walked through their business, learned everything worth knowing, and left. Most sellers sign whatever NDA the buyer wants to have them sign. They assume it's standard. They assume it protects them. The NDA is the first legally binding document in your sale process, and it was drafted by the buyer's attorney for the buyer's benefit. Understanding what's in it before you sign it is not optional. The NDA is the gatekeeper to your information. Everything that comes after it flows through that gate. A strong NDA means that information is legally protected. A weak NDA means it isn't, regardless of what both parties assume. It's also the first place in the deal where terms are established, how confidential information is defined, and what a buyer can and can't do with it. Whether they can contact your employees or customers, what happens when the deal ends. Sellers who treat the NDA as a formality are handing the buyer control of the first document in the process without reading what they agreed to. Here's what a strong NDA covers. 6 sections, each one matters. The definition of confidential information. This is the most important section in the document. If something isn't covered by definition, it isn't protected, and that's a full stop. Permitted use restrictions. The NDA needs to explicitly state that confidential information may only be used to evaluate the acquisition, not for competitive intelligence. Now, the advisor definition problem, and this one is serious. Most NDAs include a carve-out that allows the buyer to share confidential information with their advisors. Attorneys, accountants, and consultants helping them evaluate the deal. It sounds reasonable. The problem is, what happens when advisors is broadly defined or left undefined entirely? A broadly defined advisor pool can include a competitor of yours who happens to be advising the buyer. These people now have access to your financials, your customer relationships, your pricing model, and your operational details. The fix is a defined advisor list. Before you share anything, require the buyer to provide the names and roles of every person who will have access to your confidential information. That list becomes an exhibit to the NDA. Each person on it is bound by the same confidentiality obligations as the buyers. And critically, no one gets added to the list without your written approval. The NDA needs to prohibit the buyer from soliciting your employees and your customers during the evaluation period and after it. If the deal dies, the buyer walks away knowing who your best people are, who your most valuable customers are, and roughly what it would take to hire to win them. Without a non-solicitation clause that survives the deal, there's nothing stopping them from acting on that information the day after they walk away. The NDA should have a defined term. 2 to 3 years is standard. Perpetual NDAs sound protective but can create enforceability issues. What matters more than the term length is that the obligations survive termination of the deal discussions. If the buyer walks, the NDA doesn't end. Their obligations to protect your information continues through the full term. When the deal ends, for any reason, the buyer should be required to return or destroy all confidential information you shared, including digital copies. This gets missed in older NDA templates that were written before everything was digital. God, that would be a long time ago. A buyer who has your financials, your customer list, and your operational documentation saved on a server somewhere after the deal dies is a problem. An NDA without a remedy provision is a piece of paper. For the NDA to be enforceable, it needs to acknowledge that a breach causes irreparable harm, which is the legal threshold required to seek injunctive relief, meaning a court order to stop the breach immediately rather than waiting for damages in a trial. Governing law and jurisdiction should be specified, and your state is preferable. You don't want to be litigating a breach in the buyer's home state. Subscribe if you're finding this valuable. This is part of Exit Ready, my free YouTube course, and I built it because I'm tired of watching sellers get blindsided by things they could have protected themselves against. Here's how to negotiate the NDA without blowing up the conversation. The framing matters. You're not fighting the buyer, you're establishing the parameters of a professional transaction. Serious buyers who intend to close deals understand that sellers need real protection, and they build confidence. A buyer who pushes back hard on standard confidentiality provision is telling you something worth knowing before you share anything. Have your attorney redline the document. Not a marked up email from you, a professional redline from your transaction attorney. Focus your negotiation on the provisions that matter most, the definition of confidential information, the non-solicitation clause, and the remedies section. If you get those three right, you have a document with real teeth. Don't die on every hill, prioritize the ones that actually protect you. Phase 3 of the Exit Ready Vault has the NDA review checklist. Every section covered in this video organized into a checklist that you can run against any NDA before you sign it.